This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
I want to say right off that I have never had a formal course on teaching. And I suspect many of your speakers may say, of my generation in any case, may say something quite the same. So when I got this invitation from Michelle, and along with it came a long and distinguished list of teachers who have spoken in this particular series, frankly, I was a bit daunted because so many of the titles of the lectures seemed to suggest that these were teachers that knew what they were doing and could articulate them, because they would have such crisp sounding titles as 5 Essential Concepts for Successful Lecturing, 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teachers, How to Give a Lecture. I just felt as if I had never thought about those things consciously enough to articulate them. But I did take pause and find that one title really resonated with me, and that was Mark Applebaum's in the music department. And his title, was just several years ago, was The Teaching Confessional: Things I Do But Shouldn't Do, Things I Do and Should Do, Things I Don't Do and Shouldn't Do, Things I Don't Do But Should Do. And I sort of thought that perhaps Mark, whom I don't know very well, know a little bit about him, and I have seen him in action, but maybe he too, like me, thinks that he teaches somewhat by intuition and by trial and error. And you only learn as you go along things you should do and things you shouldn't do. I had one role model early on, and it was a family member, not another teacher. In fact, I have to say, I had very few what I would call today fine teachers in my college years, or in my, even if I must admit it, my graduate years. But I did have a clergyman father. My father was a congregational minister, and that meant that I had to listen to him from about 6 years on until I left for college every Sunday morning, give a 10-minute sermon, 10 to 12-minute sermon. And he was indeed something of a role model, not that I gained it just implicitly, but rather explicitly, because whenever I had to give a talk in high school, I can remember that I had to give a dry run for him, and his axioms were very basic. Be clear, be short sentences, use short sentences, use layman's language. Don't ever try to use words that your audience isn't going to be able to understand. Foreground your main ideas, repeat your main ideas, and don't worry about repeating them, because that's the idea you want to get through at the end of your talk. The one idea that he gave me, or the one lesson he gave me, was to always speak slowly, and I have to say, I probably disregard this more than any of the others. But other than that, I really, in thinking about it, feel self-taught as a teacher. And after 35 years in the classroom, I don't really, I have to say today, think much about it. I just do what comes naturally. So when I was thinking of titling my talk, I thought of almost giving it a double title, not just playing as pedagogy, but about Wanda Korn playing at pedagogy. And I'm happy to give a try at it. And it's been a good experience for me to have this invitation, because it's made me reflect on my own practices and experiences as a teacher. And to my great surprise, really, when I had to face the music and come up with a title, I did, in looking back, find something of a thread, a bit of homegrown pedagogy that I didn't quite see reflected in other people's titles, and that was the use of role-playing as an instructional tool. And that, in fact, I've been using role-playing from the very first years of teaching here on the West Coast. But again, I've never theorized it. I don't know why it works, although I'm going to argue it does work. And I am sure there are people who have written about role-playing as an instructional tool who could probably tell us much more about why it is a good way, or a formal way of teaching. But I also made another discovery, and this is an autobiographical one, and that is that I had worried about teaching and experimented much more as a teacher in my early years than I remembered. I don't remember a lot these days. I don't remember this evening that Michelle just told you about. And I really had to dig around in some old notes and dig around in some old slides to try to recreate my own growth and development as a teacher. I knew my first year of teaching because I was terrified the entire year. That was in 1965. I taught at Washington Square College, where I had graduated only 2 years earlier. I had but an MA, and I didn't think I would go on for the PhD. Women weren't being particularly encouraged still in the mid-60s, and I thought I would probably go into museum education. But someone, to my good fortune as it turns out, got ill, and then somebody else took another term off, and I was offered the opportunity to teach. I think I taught 3 courses that year at my own undergraduate institution. Just to give you a sense of that, I was about 25, and one day walking into class, the very first class I was teaching, there was a student friend of mine. She was 2 years behind me, so she still was at school, and she asked me if I was taking that class too. And I had to say, no, in fact, I'm teaching this one. And I remember just more terror striking me that my class would even include somebody that I knew as well. I can even remember her name, Kathy Parabinizov. Somebody that I had known in my own student days. Well, what I remember of that year is that I mimicked my teachers. I gave formal lectures. I probably had my head much further down, closer to the paper, I know I did, than I am right now. My teachers at that point were my graduate student teachers. They always gave slide lectures, 2 slides up at a time. Formal lectures, I wouldn't say they necessarily had a thesis, but they rattled on for an hour, and they always came in suits. They were always men, and it was a formal occasion. There was no Q&A, no discussion afterwards, and I remember that I taught exactly that same way. I did have open-door office hours, but it would only be in that context that I would actually talk to my undergraduate students. It did, however, convince me to go on for the PhD in art history. And so I immediately began the PhD program after that year of teaching. But it also taught me something that I had forgotten, which is that I was upset that I didn't know more about how to teach. I was upset with my institution, which was NYU, but even more specifically, it was the graduate program in art history, which had its own house, its own mansion up across the street from the Metropolitan Museum. So it wasn't even part of the wider campus of NYU. And it was called the Institute of Fine Arts, or familiarly, the Toot. Well, at the Toot, they never talked about teaching, and they never helped us to become teachers. They helped us entirely to become scholars, but not teachers. And what I did, going back to the Institute, was I was a student officer of the student club, and I remember saying that we ought to have a series on good teaching. And I went to the director and asked him if I could sponsor, if the student group could sponsor such a series. And I remember he said he was thrilled, actually, to have some initiative bubble up from the students, and also thrilled that he didn't have to make the invitations. I would. And I remember him giving me the sumptuous sum of $150, 3 $50 honoraria for my little speaker series on teaching. And I remember now, recalling all this, who I asked to teach. Come teach us about teaching. Milton Brown, who was an American scholar of American art, and he had helped establish a very, at that time, a kind of renegade graduate program at CUNY, and it was a program which featured particularly or specialized in American art. And Milton Brown was not someone I had studied with, though I myself was wanting to study American art, but you couldn't do that at the Toot. They didn't believe in it. So I brought him in as one of our teachers, and I remember we sat at a big seminar table just like this, and this gentleman of, he must have been in his 60s at that point, came and spoke. The second speaker was Bartlett Hayes, whom I suspect no one in this room will know, unless you have some memory of the Phillips Academy. Bartlett Hayes was a director of the Addison Gallery of American Art, and he had written a guide to modern art for laymen that deeply impressed me because it was trying to teach the rudiments of modern art to a non-specialized audience. And he brought in science, he brought in history, he brought in physics, fourth dimension studies. He did it in a way that was very accessible and impressed me deeply as the kind of teaching I wanted to do when I was teaching undergraduates. So I asked Bartlett Hayes to come down and give a lecture. And my third lecture is still one of the great models in my life for both my scholarship and teaching, and that was Leo Steinberg. I remember that Leo said it wasn't much of an honorarium, but he agreed to come anyway, and it was a great moment. He had been a graduate of the Institute, though he was then teaching at Hunter College and then went on to University of Pennsylvania. Well, as I look back on this, I realized that this was sort of the stirring of the 1960s, that is, wanting alternative models, actually acting in a kind of counterculture way. It's a thread or a story that has, I think, remained unrecorded. But as I think of it, there was a concern then that the way we were teaching art history was not accessible. It was very elite. It was talking to the choir. It wasn't trying to bring people into the history. It wasn't teaching them anything much about history at all. It was primarily, and the art history students here know this very well, it was primarily a connoisseurship rhetoric that we were using and being taught. That is, to use our eyes to decide what was a good and true Rembrandt as opposed to a Rembrandt studio hand or a Rembrandt fake. So that was one memory that I was very happy to recapture in thinking about this. I then came out to the West. We came out to the West because my husband was taking a PhD at Berkeley, and we arrived the fall of '69. Now, if any of you know your Berkeley history, that is some moment of arrival. And it was a very charged environment in every single way. And I actually felt that I got a second education through my husband's PhD in history at Berkeley because it was such a much more imaginative program than the one I had been through. Berkeley was then doing lots of what we would call today social history or history from the bottom up. And that made a great deal of, made a great impression on me as asking different questions of historical material than what we were doing in art history. But I was also in an environment where experimentation was acceptable, even almost de rigueur. So when I went to Mills College, which I did again, to my great fortune, someone became ill, Alfred Frankenstein, the great critic and teacher at that time, and I was there, ABD, without a sou, and it was just, it saved our lives, my husband's and mine. It saved, at least put some food on the table. And I went to Mills in 1970. And as I learned, in going back through my slides, I did a lot more of experimenting than I had remembered. These were very exciting years at Mills. I would say this regardless of whether I was talking about teaching or not. Dory Allen can tell you about it from first-hand experience. But I was only about, I don't know, 8 years older than most of my students, something like that, 9 years older. And at that time, Mills was, we were going around correcting everybody. When they called Mills a girls' school, we'd always say it's a woman's college. I mean, this was 1970. The women's movement had warmed up, and we were at a moment at Mills where everyone was trying to kind of reshape the curriculum to create career lines for women as opposed to just some, I would say, sort of an overlay of finishing school that pretty much had been wiped out but was still there in many pockets of the college. And that we were very much intent upon reshaping every aspect of the education our students got. So I discovered that I had done enough at Mills in 1972, this was really a surprise to me, that I actually gave a paper called Nonverbal Art History. And I gave it at the College Art Association. I found that paper. It is exactly what I'm going to talk to you about today, back in '72. But what was I talking about? That's what I'm going to bring you up to speed on. I'll show you some of the things I spoke about in that paper. In fact, I'm even using notes from that paper to remind myself what it was I had been doing. As I recall, this paper was in a counterculture session. These were such hot times that CAA, College Art Association, would have its professional meetings, and then it left some room around the edge for what the mainstream might have thought of as kind of the radical edge. And this was, as I recall, a session on teaching. And it was new methods in teaching or something like that. And I gave this paper, Nonverbal Art History. Well, the first thing, and now maybe if we could dim the lights so that the slides show better. The first example I gave in this paper of nonverbal art history was an experiment that I had done in a class at Mills when I was teaching the entire 19th century of French art. And every class of that sort has to begin with an examination of neoclassicism, and then following that, of course, the great Romanticist movement. And we did both theory, we did readings by the artists, we did, of course, studies of various works by the artists, and just to acquaint you with one of the key monuments of neoclassical painting, I give you David's Oath of the Horatii, and then just to show you Romanticism that I'm going to use as a key monument, this is Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Well, these are both what we call history paintings. Paintings, multi-figured, large, complicated paintings that depend on some story, mostly of the past, rarely of contemporary times. The Delacroix was quite in advance in that it was actually reflecting on contemporary times. But you had to, in order to understand a painting like this, not just understand the formal qualities of it, but you had to understand the story. And briefly and very quickly, these are three brothers, three triplets, pledging to their father, who is holding their swords, that they will go off to battle against the enemy country, Alba, which was also represented, conveniently enough, by the Curetii, and they also had three triplet brothers that were going to fight these three triplet brothers. And you have to know the moment, that this is a moment of pledging yourselves to loyalty of the state or of the country, above that of family. Men were strong and muscular, very carefully delineated in their body posture so that they exuded a sense of tautness and a sense of mission and promise. And the women were all fainting upon themselves over on the other side in today's very easily seen gendered kind of composition. But the women help make up the story. What you have to know is that one of those women, those are two sisters, one of them is married to one of the three brothers, or engaged, I can't remember which it is, that they're about ready to go off and fight. And that one of these brothers, I believe, is also engaged or married to one of the other side. So that there's a lot of family tragedy that is about to happen here after this oath is taken. Delacroix, just to give you, and so let me just quickly say that in neoclassicism, and when we teach about symmetry, minimalist compositions, focus being very clearly delineated, the deep space in which a little piece of theater is enacted, clear groupings, a clarity of classicism that was espoused in the Academy, that is the French Academy of Art at this time, and which is exemplified by a composition like this. Delacroix, 40 years, 50 years later, in a different vocabulary, also is still telling a story, but the emphasis now is on, in this case, it's the search for freedom, the fight for freedom amongst the French, liberty leaving the people, the allegorical figure with the French flag in her hand. But you can see that all that clarity of structure, that minimalism, that highly focused groupings has given way to what we think is the more romanticist vocabulary, and includes a great deal of violence, loss, a sense of both the excitement of the mission to fight for liberty, but at the same time, all that is destroyed at the very same moment. Well, what I did then in my experiment, first experiment, was to give my students in this class lessons in neoclassicism and romanticism, but then give them a passage from an early 19th century French historian, somebody called Charles Rollin. And that would have been the history book that artists like Delacroix, and perhaps not David, I'm not sure of my dates here, but artists would be looking at stories like this historian was telling of the ancient world. And I gave them a story that dealt with a certain king's refusal to succumb to the enemy, Xerxes and the Persian troops. And this stubborn and proud king retired to the top of a mountain with his family and his 6 sons, and he forbid any family member to submit to the conquering Persians. But out of fear, the story goes, the 6 sons decided that they had to, in fact, save the family's lives and submit to the Persians. And in finding that out, the father was so upset and felt so deceived that he had the eyes of his sons put out for disobedience. Now, that's the way history was written circa 1800, very differently than the way we write our histories today. It was a history of the ancient world, not the contemporary, and it was about loyalties, loyalties to families, to country, to the state, to higher virtues. And it was also obviously a story about patriarchy, a father's right to demand certain loyalties and have expectations of his sons. And this story shows the consequence when the family members, the sons, do not obey. So I broke the class into small groups, and I asked each of them, I gave them a copy of this story, to try to interpret the story as a neoclassicist would, like David, and how it might be interpreted in 1790, and then look at the very same story and interpret it as a romanticist, like Delacroix would some 40, 50 years later. And then I asked them to deliver their understandings as tableau vivant, that is, to act out an incident, the right incident from this story for that particular time period, and to photograph themselves, and then to bring their photographs into class, and we would show them, and we would have a discussion criticizing them in the rhetoric and terms of the time. I tried to get them to speak like critics would of the period, and decide which group got the Prix de Rome, which was a very sought-after prize that every great Frenchman artist aspired to getting. So what I'm going to show you is just a few quick examples that I was able to discover. These are the Davidian moments. This is when the sons are condemned, and I was amused to find that this, I remember it was a teacher at Mills, and I just realized with all women, of course, they had to play male parts, but they had to get somebody for the father that was more grave and weighty, so they asked one of the teachers to sit in. And then I assume these are the six sons, and this may be the wife turning away or something of that particular sort. And it was titled The Sons Condemned. And then another group did this one, I'm sorry it's so dark, called Punishment of the Sons, which actually is showing, there's a knife in here somewhere, the sons begging for mercy, and these two sons have already had their eyes put out. And you'll note that they're very, again, trying very hard to mock neoclassical costumes. They rip the sheets off their beds for the week, but they're also trying to tell the story on a single plane, as neoclassicists did, in an environment. I think this is probably the Greek theater where this was being enacted, with just a few players, and keeping the emotions, the basic emotions, that in this case of betrayal and of sorrow, and basically the idea of higher authority, keeping that to just a minimalist composition. But then when we got to Delacroix, all hell broke loose. And of course, they all chose the maiming scene, not the moment when the father condemned the sons, but actually when the sons were all maimed, and the father's stoicism in the face of actually maiming his children. And one's supposed to, of course, see the higher ideals that are being searched for here than that of family happiness. So this was called King Punishing His Six Sons. And you can see some have been, and then here's another one called Filial Punishment. And again, I can recognize this artist. This is Jens Morrison, a ceramist at Mills who was, I guess, brought in to be the father. Well, and then we had our little critique, and the Prix de Rome was awarded to the group, and I don't remember which one that was, that we decided did the best interpretations. Now, what students had to do this was, of course, study paintings by those two artists and be aware not only of which moments the two artists would choose to interpret, but also I hoped, and I thought they did a good job, in thinking through what their stylistic choices had to be, how space was to be used, what kind of a setting, what colors, and what kind of emotions, whether it be violent or nonviolence, that the two artists would require. And also, now that we know so much about performance, I can see that we also have to talk a great deal about the use of their own bodies, although that was not a language I was using at the time, because as they would perform these various tableaus, they would indeed feel, internalize the psychological moment that is being privileged. And I also always used to justify doing this because I always felt a bit sheepish about this, that maybe it was too much play and not enough study. But I always would argue, and it's true, that tableaux vivants were a common parlor game in the 19th century, so that in fact I was using a form of, that might have been more of an entertainment form, but was a form that was indigenous to the period under study. And needless to say, they also had fun, so I got some extra poses just for fun. I don't even know which one. This might be Liberty on the Barricades, completely mixed up, but you can see that they've also found a number of extras for this one. And this one I noticed was, each one of these slides was labeled. This one was called The Agony and the Ecstasy. Now, a second project that used mimic or role-playing was the class that Dory refers to, and I think she probably went through this kind of assignment, I don't remember. But it was when I would teach Cubism. It would be a 20th century class. These were always great big survey courses at that time. And Cubism's difficult for any class, whether a class of 71 or a class of 2006. It's difficult. It has a complicated history. It's a moment in history that I personally am deeply engaged with and feel is one of the most incredibly inventive moments of vocabulary and of theory of the 20th century. And just basically, one of the things you want to get across is the way that two kinds of Cubism have been named. One that gave way to the other, analytical Cubism, which then in 1912 gave way to what historians have called synthetic Cubism. These were not terms used by the artists, but by the critics and by the historians. So I would teach a Picasso such as this one, and I won't give the lesson here, Man with Guitar, but show you how abstract it became. There is actually a figure buried there, head, torso, guitar sort of in here, but very monochromatic. Not much use of color. It's called Cubism because of these facets or these sharp edges, these planes that were created in this particular moment. And it was a moment of extreme experimentation by two artists, Picasso and Braque, that lasted 3 or 4 years before it gave way to something we call synthetic Cubism, upside down synthetic Cubism in this case. But let's turn that around and you can see a still life. It's a still life with the references still to the guitar, but now the guitar is with a sound hole, a exterior shape, and that is wood-grained paper or wallpaper or oilcloth, actually in the time. The bottom of the guitar, le jeu there is a piece of newspaper that's been laid in. This was the moment in which collage was invented. So collage is very important to the history of synthetic Cubism. And here, just to kind of have fun, is a little piece of analytical Cubism that Picasso has pasted in there. Turn that upside down, and it's a glass in the old style that this kind of Cubism, all against a piece of wallpaper, was mimicking. So at Mills, I would set up a still life like this one, using, in this case, a recorder instead of a flute, which was common then, a glass, a piece of newspaper, a tablecloth, and a tabletop. And I'd ask the students, they would be utterly terrified by the assignment, but it worked always, that they had to each create one analytical and one synthetic Cubist piece. No matter what the medium, they could use collage, and they all love to use collage for the synthetic, and on the others, they had to just do the best they could with graphite, or they could use paint. At Mills at the time, there were a number of studio students who were in the class, so they always did a pretty super job on this. And then I had a little Cubist exhibition, and you can see these are the Cubist, analytical Cubist tries over here, and with a couple of synthetic ones down here, and then the more synthetic ones over here. This isn't actually hung with much rationale, best I can tell. But it was, and I think we're in one of these studios. I can't remember exactly where we did this. But here's some of the work up close. This is an effort at, as are each of these drawings, at analytical, and then these are the synthetic. The synthetic were always better than the analytical. Here's the analytical. You can kind of see that she changed the vocabulary to a bottle and to a guitar rather than my recorder and glass. Well, there is a glass in here, the table. But then the synthetic ones were really quite good, where they could use actual pieces of newspaper, actual pieces of cloth. I think this one is almost entirely a collage. It may have a little additional ink line there. Couple of, I think this one's supposed to be analytical. It veers so clearly into synthetic that I'd have to say that this person hasn't quite got the earlier style. Does it very well there. Here's one where Matisse seems to have entered the vocabulary, much more boldly colored than would be quite right for 1913, 1914. But I wanted to give you a sense of the range because they would be kind of fun, and you can quickly get a sense, actually, I found as a teacher, as to whether they get the differences between the two. And they could sometimes be quite good. This one is quite good, even if it's very fanciful, and sometimes they're just kind of amateur, such as this one. But nevertheless, the point would be made, I could make the point, as we would go through and do the critiques. And we always did critiques in groups, so that I wasn't the only one critiquing, but so were the other students. And that also helped them learn how to think about Cubism, not just because they had made it, but they could also see how other people had made their Cubist works and where they were better and informed or had just did better jobs. So it was pretty much a group experience, and it always seemed to work very much, and I always had people telling me that they learned their Cubism in that class and never forgot it, and always having a high point when they would go to the Museum of Modern Art and actually see the real thing. And then my last kind of group experience at Mills was I would always have a surrealist either evening or occasion where we would take over the art gallery. And the students would get in there ahead of time and decorate and would make, everybody had to make surrealist objects. They came as surrealist people. Here are 4 of them. And dressed just somewhat ludicrously, but I will also suggest to you a lot of the thematics that they use, that of, for instance, exposed breasts or underwear or the underwater paraphernalia is actually, you can actually find things in Surrealism. I think Tanguy is somebody she's trying to think of there, the second one in from the left. And the hairstyle, of course, was just, and the mustache, we're trying to act like a Surrealist male wearing female clothing. So there was a lot of concepts of the Surrealism that got embedded in their objects. The use of mannequins or dolls, if you know your Surrealism, was very popular and very disorienting and disrupting when you would see human forms torn apart as they are here and put into a birdcage. And some of you will know Bellmer's work, the German Surrealist, that this person is referring to. Or the use of mannequins, and there are lots of mannequins within the show, but here's one that I picked up that was particularly elaborate. The use of eyes. We had seen Dali's film Chien Andalou, and so there were eyes everywhere in my slide remembrances, these looking back out from the back of a male head, and these were hors d'oeuvres that you could pick up, each one of them an eye or a piece of a mouth. Food was also, this is fumage, which is a surrealist technique where you would use smoke from a candle and you would create drawings, hoping that your unconscious would take control. You wouldn't try to create anything rational or anything that was literal or figurative, but just let the smoke make its own design and then have a look at it from a surrealist point of view. Because we were at a women's college, they were fascinated by the sexuality that went throughout surrealist work, particularly sexuality of women. Isn't this Linda Bauer? I think so. Anyway, so she's pasted that torso on herself. That's not her actual torso, but she's taken it out of a Playboy or something of that sort and put it on. People were very clear when they made their food. Food could become all kinds of genitalia, and 2 up close will make that very clear, a breast and something phallic. It was hard to eat at these parties, I have to say, but there was plenty of food. When I came to Stanford, I had all these experiments under my belt, but I think 2 things had changed. One is, I think the times had changed. I wasn't in Berkeley anymore, and it wasn't 1970, it was 1980. And we had gotten past what people call the 60s, which was really the 70s. So that when I came here, I knew those days were over. I think I also was very intimidated by a Stanford, a university, as opposed to a college. and that I felt I had to straighten up myself and not. These were never the only assignments I gave. I, of course, did all the regular papers and exams and stuff, but I did feel as if probably I wouldn't go back. That those were my special days, my special Mills years, and I looked very fondly, almost nostalgically upon them, but I thought those years were over. In fact, when I look at my 25 years at Stanford, little by little, pieces of those assignments have crept back into my curriculum. For instance, I do teach a class that's today called Transatlantic Modernism, Paris and New York in the early 20th century. And rather than the whole 20th century, I teach a class that's just the years between the war primarily. And every year I still have an occasion, a salon in this case. It's morphed into Gertrude Stein's salon. And I was able to, in my own home, because I had a big open space, invite the entire class. In fact, I invited anybody the class wished to bring with them to have an evening chez Gertrude Stein. And as the price of admission, each student had to bring a modern portrait. I have no slides, unfortunately, of these events. I have a couple of other show and tells, but I don't have slides. In this class, we look a lot at the way portraiture was changed. It was modernized at the time. And the way in which artists used objects or characteristics, references to the person they were portraying without literally portraying the person's head, bust, and features. And it's called modern portraiture. It's sometimes called referential or symbolic portraiture. This, for instance, is called A Young American Girl in the Nude, and it's clearly based on a spark plug used for an automobile. And it's by a French artist, Picabia, but who made this in New York, and made this about an American woman that he knew. And it is what we call anthropomorphic or mechanomorphic. This is a woman with a hat. She's got a necklace on. She's got a torso forever. He may have had an affair with her. We're not sure. Agnes Meyer was her name. And then she's prancing around in her skirt and her two little legs, which come out. You're supposed to read this, of course, amusingly, but be able to see the clever ways in which this modern artist has created a portrait of somebody who was in the modernist circle at that time. Well, each one of my students makes a portrait of somebody in the class in this non-figurative mode. And that's the price of admission to coming to the evening coming to the Salon of Gertrude Stein. And students are invited to come in costume. The last time we had Josephine Baker came, a dance major. She came in her banana skirt that she had worked up. There's always a Marcel Duchamp or two, sometimes 3 or 4, because students enjoy his works very much and are very puzzled and moved by it. And Marcel Duchamp always comes in a tie or dressed up as the Mona Lisa. Picasso always is there in a striped shirt. And we do a variety of events while there. We have judging of the portraits that the students have done, and we give prizes, you know, the most Duchamp or the most Picasso or the most outrageously futurist and so on. Graduate students recreate futurist plays. Futurist plays are very short, and we have a couple of dress rehearsals, and they do a great job. We even have a futurist play where we get the entire assembly. We usually have about 100 people at these events recreating one of these plays. And I dress up as Gertrude Stein and do readings from her work. And I will pass this around, but it was covered in the, this is the only one I have, but this one's kind of precious because I try to bulk up to be Gertrude. And I wear a beret, which Gertrude never would have done. But I also that time had a little white poodle. And if you know Stein's life, she had her pet poodle, Baskets, was an important part of her life. She always had a pet poodle. And somebody loaned a poodle to me for the evening. So that's the great little touch in that picture. And you'll notice that behind me is a wall filled with these portraits that each of the students has brought. I also, in another mode, I've also continued to do something at Mills where, at Mills I can remember I gave assignments where people had to criticize in the voice of Diderot. They had to write a Diderot piece of criticism. Or when we got to modernism, I asked them to write a Roger Fry piece of criticism. In other words, to write in the voice and from the ideological and aesthetic position of a particular critic in a very different period than our own. And I've continued to do that at Stanford with great success. For instance, I have a very conservative article written by one Kenyon Cox, who was an academic artist, responding to the Armory show and to modern art in general. This was a real live article of about 1914, let's say, something like that. And I asked each student to write a rebuttal to it, that they should take the identity of either Alfred Stieglitz or an Ashcan school artist, both of which I have already taught by this moment in the class, and they should write a letter to the editor rebutting the essay by Kenyon Cox. So they have to, again, move into the shoes, take up the pen of a different person than they are at that particular moment, and actually role play as a critic in favor of modern art would respond to somebody who had written a rather vicious piece about the errors of modernism and its youthful excesses. And I find that when I do this, students become much more attentive to rhetoric, to historical rhetoric. They go and they read and they find the words of judgment that are being used. I find that they read much more carefully the criticism of that particular person or the artist that they are assuming. It makes them just more attentive to period I, the period I, if I can use that term, which is a term I borrow from Baxendall. I also have had them, for the last few years, write a Gertrude Stein styled portrait. And if you know Gertrude Stein's work, here's one of her portraits of Matisse, where she, in her inimitable way of using repetition and one word over and over again, speaking in the first tense, wrote a non-figurative portrait. That is, this was the same as what I just showed you of Picabia, but in the written word and in text, where the artist is not named, but just he goes through. And you have to know through the characteristics that are evoked which artist she is speaking of. So what I ask students to do is to write one-page Gertrude Stein portrait of someone other than Matisse or Picasso, whom she wrote portraits to and they use as their models, but they have to write it about an artist we've studied in class. And then in sections, they read these works aloud to each other and without mentioning the name of who it is. And by the end of the reading, then it's open to the class to decide which person was the object of that portrait. And by and large, people get them. I've gone to these classes very often because I enjoy listening, but I also stress that they have to read as Gertrude would read her portraits. And I use a record that was taken of her in the 1930s, reading her portraits of Picasso and Matisse. The students have heard them in class, so they get a sense of her wonderful locution and her rhythms and her way of reading musically. And they do that in class as well. Another thing that I've used to great effect is debates in class. Debates around very crucial issues that very often were newsworthy at a particular moment in the period that I'm teaching. For instance, I've taught a class a couple of times on the 1930s and into the 1940s. And that would include the regionalists like Grant Wood, but it would also include the beginning of abstract, or what's called New York School art, the era of Jackson Pollock. And after reading firsthand accounts by each of these artists, but also reading criticism of the period, I've had I've laid out a proposition, and to this I didn't have time to look it up, but I laid out a proposition. I divided the class into two groups. I made the regionalists versus the abstractionists, and they debated that proposition, and really amused me because I didn't say anything about costumes, but all the people arguing for regionalism, figurative work of the local scene, work that takes seriously the costuming and rituals of a particular region, that of Grant Wood. They came all dressed looking like the two figures in this painting. And then these guys, the Pollock crowd had seen a very famous photograph of the abstractionists where they're all in suit and tie and with cigarettes in their hands. And they all came in and they ran their debate looking like Rothko de Kooning and Pollock. I've had a debate on this painting by Whistler, which Ruskin criticized. In a famous piece of criticism, he said it was nothing more than throwing a pot of paint in the public's face. And Whistler sued him for slander, for slandering him in the press. And there's a very famous court trial where Ruskin and Whistler, Ruskin doesn't take the stand on his own, but his lawyer does, duke it out as to whether this is a work of art, valuable, finished, and worth the price being asked for it, versus Ruskin's position, which is that it doesn't show skill, it's not finished, it was thrown together in less than a day. He had a whole set of criteria that he wanted it to match, he being much more on the side of, let's say, the pre-Raphaelite aesthetic. And this has proven to be a wonderful debate. They can actually read some of the court proceedings that they can then mimic. And one day we actually had a mother in the class when this debate went on. Whistler wins this debate, but he, in true life, back in the late 19th century, but he won it with irony. The judge only awarded him a farthing, which is less than a penny, damages. So in fact, he won no monetary recompense for the case. But he did win the case, that he had been slandered. And the mother of one of my students came up afterwards and she said, you know, if that case had been tried in America, Whistler would have lost and Ruskin would have won, because we have a much stronger tradition of freedom of the press than the English do. And she explained that to all the students sitting there, so it was just a kind of wonderful little add-on learning experience that came out of it. Lastly, I'll just tell you about two other kinds of assignments that have worked very well in present-day Stanford. Last quarter, I taught a course that I've done several times on the Art Museum, Theories and Practices. And we always have a final assignment that has something to do with a visit to a museum or proposing an exhibition for a museum. One very successful assignment we did, I say we because my husband and I were teaching it in Washington, D.C.'s program, Stanford program. We had them visit a small museum we had not visited as a group and critique the museum and see what it could do better, and then write a proposal to a granting agency. We gave them some made-up agency that gave money to small museums to do projects. They had to write a proposal that would grant money to the museum to do better what they felt it was not doing well then. And that was really we got fantastic, such good papers that I actually sent copies to each of the museums they had gone to, because I thought they might learn something as to what an outsider saw that wasn't going so well in their particular museums. This last time, and I'll pass these around, last quarter I asked students to, in the same class, I asked students to propose an exhibition for the Cantor Gallery, a specific gallery at the Cantor Center. It's upstairs. And they proposed, as you'll see, there's a write-up, there's a list of works, there is a set of programs that would be carried on if their show were realized, and they had to make a formal 10-minute presentation to all the curators at the Cantor at the end of the quarter. And each of the curators had a copy of this prospectus to study before they heard the reports. And then the curators and me and a couple of others that had been in attendance for all, I had 14 students do this project. Two of them will get to realize their projects next year at the Cantor Center. And one of them is this beefcake project, which is going along, which is actually the most amazing cache of stuff. The students have to use objects that they would find on campus for this project so that these exhibitions can be realized without too much money. And this gal found something that I don't know anybody else knows that we have, but we actually have the work of somebody who did male physique photographs for Beefcake magazines in the 1950s and 60s, very pre-Mapplethorpe. But if you look at what's in that, and some of it's probably X-rated, you'll see that, in fact, this is the kind of work that Mapplethorpe had absorbed in his own formative experiences and aestheticized and then brought it out in art. Finally, and I have a couple of my graduate students here, I've even taken this into the graduate level, which I never thought I would do, and I never even thought of it in this context before this assignment. But I have done two assignments that have worked very well. Probably the one that's worked the best is that in a particular class, the final assignment is to create a syllabus for a course you'd like to teach. and they have to do a draft of it halfway through the class, and then they have to, which everybody looks at, everybody criticizes, there's lots of exchange, and then they come back at the end of the class and give a finished syllabus. And best I can tell, at least 4 of those courses have actually been taught as these students have gone out into the world and needed a syllabus. They were able to draw on this syllabus. And for many of them, it's the first syllabus they've had to make on their own because, at least in our department, they teach sections, but they don't teach full courses. So this gives them an opportunity to do something, and it does mean that they have to study their teacher's syllabi. It's amazing how little they actually have absorbed about what a syllabus looks like until they get this assignment. And then I can recognize little pieces of myself and Professor Marin and over here and Professor Lee over here. I can see how all our syllabi have been kind of pushed together in their examples. And then I've also had students create research proposals in the form of a dissertation proposal. I've only done that once. And it sort of worked. It worked if the student was close enough to coming to write a dissertation proposal. If they were brand new to the program, it worked less well. But I have, using the formula of what we expect in a dissertation proposal, had a research proposal come out of a seminar on another subject. Now, what do all these assignments have in common? I have to go quickly here. First of all, they are all performative. They're all trying on a role, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. You're pretending, yes, but you're also bodily and intellectually experiencing the position of what I'll call an other. And secondly, you have to do it. You have to know something to do it well. You have to have done close looking. You have to have had reading. You have to have models. If it's a historical assignment like the tableau vivants, you have to grasp something of the period I, or what I might call the period rhetoric. Even these assignments for graduate students are trying on the role of being a college teacher when they write their first course syllabus. And I find that students work very hard on these assignments. They don't just blow them off. They really take them very seriously. They require imagination. They require you to think outside of the academic box. And this, by the way, makes some students extremely anxious. I never remember anybody at Mills wanting to know how they would be evaluated on such assignments, but I do remember a lot of Stanford students asking me that question. They worry whether they have the talent. Stanford students worry whether they're smart enough to do this kind of assignments. They know how to write papers and read books. They learn from one another, I think, positive. Most of these are group assignments. They're at least shared, so they get to learn from what other people do with the same assignments. Students enjoy the break from the usual classroom routines, and I have just as many ordinary days in the classroom as these extraordinary days. But I've learned to place these kinds of assignments somewhere in the middle of the quarter, not at the very end or I'll lose everybody. I still have to get some of their energy before the end of quarter comes along. And I've learned that they enliven the course at midpoint. They bring more bonding between the students, and they're all ready for a slightly different kind of assignment. And lastly, of course, students have some fun during the enactments. These assignments, I almost always get some kind of mention on many of my evaluation sheets about them, and they stay in people's memory banks. I've been at Stanford long enough that when I go to alumni events now, I'm likely to find one of my own students from 20 years ago coming up to the podium to say hello. And most recently, somebody came up and said, "I was the one in the banana skirt. Do you remember?" Thank you very much. Can we take a quick question or two? I know I've talked much too long. I thought I had nothing to say. Hello.
Thank you very much for what has been my introduction to art history.
Oh, well, we do better over there. Come please.
Something you started to address at the very end of your talk, what would you say are 2 or 3 insights or high-level takeaways that you think could be applied to teaching other subjects in whatever context? You know, math, English.
Okay, well, I guess the experiential would be one. Can you imagine doing something where you actually have to put into your body and into your head a kind of experience that you could not have in contemporary life or would not have as normative, right? So that would be one thing to kind of try to extract from this and take to other fields. I think probably pedagogically, everybody is for as much student interaction as possible in their assignments. That just seems to be what everybody's looking for today. So see if you can find an assignment whereby they aren't just doing this as individuals, but are somehow doing it in interaction with other members of the class. Sometimes it takes discussion amongst people. For instance, for these debates, they have to get together 10 people have to get together and decide what their 10 points are going to be, for instance. So anything you can do that makes them get together to do one of these enactments, I find works very well. I think you have to give them a certain amount of information. You can't do these kinds of assignments without having gotten them ready. And a lot of times they don't know they're being gotten ready. I mean, I'm doing the work in the classroom, and they don't know that this assignment's coming along. Or if they do, they haven't started to worry about it yet. And I'm actually feeding them a whole bunch of information that they can then draw upon when it comes to one of these assignments.
Just a very brief follow-up question that goes along with getting people into this experiential learning. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you thought it was really important to get students in the psychological moment, for instance, when they were doing those reenactments. What do you think is the secret to that? Because that seems to be something that could be a really tough thing to do.
You know, it's interesting you say that. I have never had trouble doing that. They sort of do that without too much coaching on their part. I don't do anything particularly. I give them the assignment, and I think that the kids today are relaxed enough and natural enough about this kind of assignment. They're the ones that go further than I ask when they put on costumes, for instance, and take on mannerisms. Sometimes in these debates, like the Ruskin debate, the one side came in ties with Ruskin, and they were very clear, sentence-oriented. They used not only the language, but they asked questions in a very haughty way of Whistler. They were dismissive. And there's Whistler being cool, because he was a very cool dude, and he just had an answer for every one of those questions. So I guess I have to say I haven't worked so hard at that. I've given assignments that force you to do that, but I don't have to give them too much instruction.
So to summarize what you're saying, you think that when people are put in these creative opportunities, then they basically take on the role and really make it happen for themselves?
They do.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Do you find it especially challenging to set for yourself reasonable grading criteria? That scares me.
Yeah.
Both for individuals and especially when you have groups working together?
Yeah. I don't grade these ones that are without a text. I have, not at Stanford anyway. And I don't think I did at Mills. I can't remember. I do give credit. They have to have done the assignment, in other words. With the Cubism, for instance, I remember I wouldn't grade because that would then terrify them. Yeah. But they had to do it in order to pass the course. I have graded some of the, and on the Gertrude Steins, I never grade, but it's so clear which ones are good and which ones are not so good. And they learn that themselves just listening to each other. And then I have the 3 or 4 best read at the Gertrude Stein Salon. And if that person who writes a good Gertrude Stein generally is a very good student anyway, I find. So if I needed to give a little extra credit at the end to make a grade go one way or the other, I would, I'd look to see. But it's basically check minus, check plus for anything like this that is done in sections.
So for grading, you have basically more conventional assignments.
I do.
And then this is a lot of subversive real learning, but
something like that. I have to grade, right? That's part of our.
Yeah.
That's part of our command.
Right.
But that's right. I always have an exam at the end, and I have a paper. I do grade the papers when they have to write in the voice of a critic. I have graded those, and there I can kind of sort them out and figure out what an A minus B plus B is, and really justify it to myself. And what I do is I always Xerox the best, and then if some students come in saying they didn't quite get the assignment, I say, well, why don't you take these home and take a look at what somebody else was able to do with the same material. I use a lot of student work to show other students. For instance, one of the students came in to talk to me about her museum proposal. It didn't get the best, it got a B, fine grade, but nevertheless, for Stanford students, we know how they feel about Bs. And I sent her home with 4 of the proposals, sample proposals, so that she could see what other students did in that class with that same assignment, and asked her to come back in a couple of weeks so we can discuss it. Yes?
Sorry to ask another question. Based on your experience teaching this at the college level, how transferable do you think these techniques and skills are to teaching K through 12?
Well, they're probably very transferable. And I've always worried quite the opposite, that I was taking techniques that would surely work, at least in K through 12, and bringing them into the
my question
high learning.
Because a lot of college students are quite motivated and they'll really take on these things, and there's a lot more variability in the lower grades.
Yeah. Well, I I do know that probably Michelle can cite chapter and verse of examples of this is used in secondary education. There must be case studies out there of such learning, experiential learning. I'm just guessing. As I said, I've never read the Pedagogy. I just make these things up and have a good time doing it.
And we don't specialize either in the K through 12.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's one more question, I think. Well, thank you
all.
so much.
Oh.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.